Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Linda Durhack, the Energy and Climate Outreach Associate here at Illinois Extension. I'll be your moderator for this webinar today. This is the first of a two-part webinar series on grid resilience, where we'll be exploring how we can build a more resilient grid in Illinois. The Union of Concerned Scientists recently released a report, Keeping the Lights On, which is what serves as the basis for this webinar series. This webinar is also co-sponsored by Prairie Rivers Network. I'd like to extend a big thank you to them for their work in facilitating this presentation. So first I'll go over some just general guidelines and then we'll get to the introductions. So first off, we are recording this webinar. You will get a link to the recording and contact information for the speakers in the next few days, as well as some resources and their report. You can always find local government education webinars on our YouTube channel. And with that, we'll do a round of introductions for our speakers. So joining us, we have Sam Gomberg, who is the Associate Director for Transmission Policy with the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Sam's primary focus areas include clean energy integration and modern grid issues. In his role at UCS, Sam has published numerous reports, including analyses of the economic and technical feasibility of transitioning our electricity sector away from its current over-reliance on fossil fuel resources. He holds a BS in environmental science from the University of Florida, a master's degree in environmental management from Duke University, and a Juris Doctor from Lewis and Clark School of Law. Next, we have Dr. Rachel Licker, who is a climate scientist with wide-ranging expertise on climate change impacts and policy. She is currently the principal of Connected Science LLC, through which she collaborates with nonprofits as well as government and academic researchers alike, providing scientific, policy, and communications expertise to further climate change science and action. Dr. Licker earned her PhD in Environment and Resources and her BS in Biology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She also holds an MS in Environmental Studies and Sustainability Science from Lund University in Sweden. Next, we have Seat Sathya, she is a research officer with the Climate Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. She focuses on advancing equity and justice in energy technologies and policies through rigorous research and analysis. Her work prioritizes addressing systemic inequities by bridging technical insights with the knowledge and leadership of communities most affected by energy decisions. She's committed to transforming energy systems in ways that are not only cleaner, but fairer, more democratic, and rooted in care. She holds a background in environmental policy, is currently pursuing a Master of Science in Energy Policy, and has completed a fellowship with the Clean Energy Leadership Institute, as well as equitable energy transition programs through Yale. And lastly, we have James Gignac, who is the Midwest Policy Director for the Climate Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Prior to joining UCS, he served as Environmental and Energy Counsel and as Assistant Attorney General to Illinois Attorney General Lisa Madigan, where he worked on a variety of regulatory, legislative, and litigation matters involving clean energy, climate change, and environmental protection. He also earned a JD from Harvard Law School and a BA in History and Political Science from Albion College. So thank you so much to our presenters today, and I will turn it over to them.
Oh, that's probably me. Hello. Hi. Thank you, folks. And thanks everyone for joining us. Before we just dive right into the weeds, we wanted to do a little Menti poll just to get people a bit engaged and start thinking about things on the same page. So if you scan the code on your screen, I think it's, this question should pop up and you can provide responses on your phone, and then it should create a little word graphic, I believe, right here on the screen. Is that right, Seat?
Yeah, that's right.
Yes. Perfect. Okay, this is pretty cool. I'll just say it. Thanks for setting that up. So as we're still getting responses in and the word cloud is building out, there's a lot of words in here. Safety, right in the right front and center, healthy, sustainability, affordability, a healthy environment, prosperity, clean water, reliable power, livable planet. And thank you for your responses. And, I think in the context of today's discussion, one of the things I think we wanted to point out is that the vast majority of responses shown here on this word cloud to some degree rely on a modern, reliable, affordable, clean electricity supply, right? When we think about prosperity, when we think about sustainability, safety, a healthy environment, healthy foods even, all of these things are somehow connected in a relatively direct way to the ability to produce energy reliably, deliver it to consumers in a reliable manner, to do it in a way that doesn't harm the environment, that doesn't harm public health, and to do it in a way that is affordable, so that we can achieve these things that we want for either ourselves or our family or our future generations. And so that is sort of the context, I think, that UCS tries to approach a lot of its energy work, and I think is particularly relevant to some of the research we're going to present to you today. So next slide, please. So I want to start with a little bit of Grid 101, because I know that probably a lot of people are coming from different places in the audience. And of course, you don't spend all your days down in the weeds on this stuff like some of us here at UCS do. And there's a lot of moving parts to what we sort of talk about generally as the grid as a whole. And even getting on the same page regarding terminology can be helpful. So the next couple slides are really about some distinctions that I think will be helpful to be aware of if we're going to not just have a good conversation here, but if we're going to be successful advocates for the people and the communities that we represent. So the term grid really encompasses, at a very high level, three relatively distinct segments displayed on this slide. There's the generating resources of all stripes, power plants, everything from coal to solar to nuclear to hydropower, et cetera, et cetera. There's the transmission system, which are really the large high voltage wires that connect the generating plants to the communities or consumers being served. And then there's this distribution system that really moves the power around that community or that local utility service territory. And each has its own regulatory regime. So there's overlapping local, state, and federal jurisdictions here, but each kind of operates under its own decision-making process. Each has sort of a unique set of stakeholders, and each brings a variety of costs and benefits to consumers. So if we're thinking about strategic goals that we might want to accomplish, we need to be aware of the specific dynamics of where we're engaging. Sort of, if it's generating stations, obviously federal agencies like the EPA and the Department of Energy have a lot of jurisdiction, so do state regulatory bodies, not just the Utility Commission, but we're talking about environmental regulators, et cetera. Transmission lines can be, a whole different, there's the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that, states have some limited role. A lot of decision-making is made by sort of the utilities. And then at the distribution system, there's obviously local regulations, local needs, local goals that are all driving decision-making. So understanding that you have these specific but overlapping sort of decision-making processes and regulatory regimes, I think is important when we think about being successful advocates. I really like this particular graphic though, because it also has some representation of the fact that even as the grid is evolving, the distinctions are getting muddier and muddier, right? So here, if you look in the middle at the bottom, it shows a transmission customer. Think of this as a large energy user like a data center that is going to connect directly to the transmission system. Another way to think about how these things overlap and kind of get muddied is rooftop solar, which is a generator that is connected at the distribution side, right? And because all of this is interconnected, obviously, it's certainly not black and white distinctions. So you need to sort of understand how that grid is evolving. But I think generally for our purposes today, it's important to understand that we have these three sort of buckets of where decisions, really key decisions, are made about our energy future, and that each one probably takes a certain distinct level of understanding and engagement to make change. Hopefully that's clear. It's a big topic we could spend a lot of time on. A lot of the research we're going to present today is really in the context of this middle slice, the transmission system. So those are the big wires, like I said, that you see strung across the states that are carrying power over long distances, large amounts of power over long distances. The transmission system is where a lot of our research focused for this particular report. Now let's drill in a little bit on the transmission system itself. Next slide, please. So the transmission system, as we think about it, because these wires, these large wires, often cross state lines, because they're carrying electricity from state to state in interstate commerce, there's a large federal regulatory role in how this system is built and operated. So that jurisdiction flows through the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, who over the past 20 years or so has overseen this sort of segmentation that you see on the slide today of the nation's loosely connected transmission system into more geographically discrete transmission planning regions. Within each of these regions, there is at least a basic level of coordination that is required by FERC around operating the system and making decisions about how to invest in the system. So sort of getting at this sort of theme of distinctions in these first couple slides, you can see there's very little coordination that goes on between these different regions. But within each region, there is a dedicated coordination function amongst utilities and states, and a dedicated decision-making process about how we're going to build out the transmission system in each of these regions. One thing to note, and why it's really critically important, and as you might note here, Illinois has two colors, right? So it has two of these regions represented in its state. Each of these, MISO, PJM, SDP, et cetera, has very distinct levels of transparency, accountability, who gets to engage in the decision-making processes, how much interaction there is with stakeholders. All of that can vary very significantly from region to region. So not only do we need to understand the let's say, regulatory regime and the decision-making process from generation to transmission to distribution, we also then need to understand how do decisions get made and how do things actually get done in the region where I am operating, because it can vary quite significantly from region to region. Let me drill down a little further, or actually I'll hand it over to James just to talk a little bit more about the Illinois specific. Next slide, please.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. So I want to share a little bit about Illinois specifically. So here in Illinois, we have 3 investor-owned utilities, or what we call IOUs. And that means that these are private companies who distribute electricity through what we call their distribution systems. So one side of that chart that Sam showed, these are the poles and wires and equipment in our communities. And those systems are regulated by a state regulatory body, which here in Illinois is the Illinois Commerce Commission. And so we have Commonwealth Edison, ComEd, in the northern part of the state. Mid-American has a small amount of territory in the northwest part of the state. And then Ameren serving the central and southern portions of the state. These utilities also own and operate power lines and facilities at the transmission level. So that's the jurisdiction of the regional transmission organizations that Sam spoke about. ComEd is a member of PJM, whereas Ameren and Mid-American belong to MISO. The white areas on this map within the state, those represent municipal or cooperative utility areas where these three IOUs do not have service territory. So municipal utilities are owned by a municipality. An example is City Water, Light and Power in Springfield. And then we have the cooperatives are owned by their individual customers. Now, munis and co-ops are not regulated by the Illinois Commerce Commission, with the idea being that they are either accountable to elected officials or they have boards of directors elected by their customers. I do want to note there's numerous other munis and co-ops, as we call them, particularly in the Ameren territory, that have overlapping service territory. So while Ameren serves all of the green areas in this map through things like transmission infrastructure, there are a couple dozen co-ops that exist throughout the area and whose individual customers are not Ameren customers. And then quickly on generation. So in 1997, the Illinois legislature restructured our power sector. So that resulted in these investor-owned utilities no longer owning power generation. So the idea was to make electricity generation a competitive market. Some munis and co-ops do, however, continue to own generation themselves. Illinois is an energy exporter, so that means we produce more electricity than we consume on an annual basis. Traditionally, we had large amounts of nuclear and coal power plants. In recent years, we've seen increasing amounts of coal plant retirements and then being replaced with increased gas and renewables. And because of our restructured power sector, it means that a lot of the activity to influence the power market resides at the legislature to enact policies to shape that market. For example, we have a renewable portfolio standard, and we have the Illinois Power Agency, which actually procures electricity for ComEd and Ameren customers. So that makes our state a little different than traditionally regulated states where the regulated utilities continue to own generation, and there's more activity around things like utility resource planning and the state commissions. We'll talk a lot more about Illinois policy in part 2 of our webinar series, but that's what I wanted to share for now, and give it back to Sam.
Awesome. Thank you, James. And we've just thrown in the first 15 minutes a ton at you. And so I just want to acknowledge that. If there's anything to take away from these first couple slides, it's just that it's, you know, putting aside the complexity of the physics of actually delivering electricity every minute of the day and year. That there's a lot of complexity and moving pieces in terms of how decisions are made in this space. And, you know, I think I can speak for everyone here at UCS that, you know, we're happy to be a resource for folks who want to try to navigate this and figure out, how do I impact decision making? What carrots and sticks do I maybe have at my disposal to use to try to influence decision making, et cetera? You know, figuring out where and how to advocate can be complex, and I think we're happy to be a resource for anyone that's interested in doing that. So hopefully, if that's the only takeaway from your first couple slides, then that's a win. So I work primarily in the transmission space, the big wires. I work primarily at MISO, which covers a big chunk of the Midwest per the map on a previous slide. And I work generally under this umbrella of achieving a modern grid. So how do we define what we mean by a modern grid? And I think some of the responses to the Menti poll at the beginning get at that. I've listed 5 here that I think capture a bunch of what UCS is focused on. the top row, reliability, clean energy, affordability, I think are, widely acknowledged throughout the industry and at least held up as ideals by most folks in terms of what we're trying to achieve as we think about investing in the system. The bottom row is really where a lot of our most recent research and the research we're presenting today is focused on. So not only do we want a reliable, clean, and affordable electricity supply or grid, we want that to be equitable and we need it to be resilient. Because climate change, unfortunately, is here and it's coming, and we're going to get further into that in a minute. So, sort of working in those two additional requirements for what we think of as a modern grid is where we sort of started our research. And we started thinking about what are the gaps in terms of preparing for climate change? What are the gaps in terms of really serving communities in an equitable way? And, what is the science telling us that can help us inform, what changes and what advocacy positions, we think we need to take to achieve equity and resilience. So next slide, please. Let's talk a little bit about resilience. And one of the things really coming out of the work that we do and a lot of the research that we've done is really acknowledging that there is a very clear distinction between reliability and resilience, to the point that resilience really does need to be its own metric with its own criteria in terms of how we're making decisions. So reliability really deals with the day-to-day conditions, the day-to-day routine uncertainty. There's always a squirrel chewing on a wire or a tree limb that falls. The system is never operating perfectly. I can say that with some certainty, right? So you're constantly having to adjust to things that just, unforeseen conditions that are relatively small, right? In terms of the stress level and the blood pressure in the room of the guy, operating the system, he's used to this every day, right? Blood pressure is good. And, and he's dealing with these little hiccups that occur throughout the day, pretty much every day. Any potential outage is probably in the magnitude of seconds to maybe an hour or a couple hours. It typically has a small geographic impact, and any sort of economic losses that come from that outage are minimal and very localized. Resilience, on the other hand, really deals with what we call high impact, low frequency events. Think of extreme weather. This is the tornado or the intense thunderstorm or the hurricane or the extreme heat wave, et cetera, that don't happen all the time. But when they do, they tend to have a very big impact, right? And that drives the blood pressure of the control operators much higher, right? These are things they're not used to dealing with. These are things that are going to take significant remediation measures to try to limit the impact and recover from the event. Outages, when they do occur, can last days to months and span over a very large geographic area. And that, of course, leads to significant economic and losses and cascading impacts. So we'll get into each of those as we go through. So that distinction really drove us to realize we can't house this under the reliability umbrella, right? We need this to be a separate metric that we're incorporating into how we make decisions about what investments we're going to make in the transmission system. Next slide, please. And I'll try to be quick. So just a couple things to really elevate this point. Because it takes a decade to design, approve, and build a transmission line, and then they're in the ground and they're operating for 40, 50 or more years. Right now we're building the grid that we're going to be relying on in 2050 and beyond. That was a real light bulb, I think, for us. There is a real sense of urgency here. A lot of times you will hear people call them high impact, low probability events. And this is really a misnomer because, again, if you're thinking about things over this 40, 50-year timeline, the frequency of, let's say, a hurricane or a really intense heat wave may not be every year, but the probability of one occurring over that time frame is actually quite high, and climate change is increasing those probabilities. And so with those two real realizations, then we realize, okay, we need to work this into our decision-making process. And how do we do that? Well, it starts with understanding the risks that we're facing from climate change, from extreme weather, understanding what we're risking in terms of the costs. What are the costs to our communities if we don't do something to address this? Or conversely, what are the benefits of addressing this risk? And then really drilling down, how do these risks manifest themselves to the communities we're trying to serve, right? And understanding the disparities there and being able to find metrics and find ways to think through that and address the inequities that are really sort of embedded in our current system about how we're delivering electricity to communities. So with that, next slide, please. I will turn it over to Dr. Rachel Licker to talk some more about some of the challenges that the grid is facing.
Thanks, Sam, so much. So yeah, now we are going to shift into why do we need to be talking about this issue of resilience in the first place? And probably it won't be news to many of you, that climate change, as Sam said, is happening. It's affecting all of us. I often like to think about it as in terms of impacts like a quilt across the entire country, where each sort of part of the quilt might be a little bit different, but together we're all experiencing it in one shape or form. So just to kind of step back for a minute and think about this issue, of course, weather has always been a dominant cause of power outages. But of course, as climate's changing, the US is seeing more frequent and intense extreme weather events. And as a result, the US has been also experiencing more frequent and intense power outages. There was one study done by Climate Central, another nonprofit, looking at related issues, in which the authors found that there was a 67% increase in weather-related power outages between 2000 to 2020. In another such study, the authors found that major weather-related power outages, so those are the ones that affect 50,000 plus customers or interrupt service of 300 megawatts or more, nearly doubled over the last decade compared with the previous one. And as I said, no region of the United States is immune to the effects of climate change. And those ones that are most consequential can vary from region to region or even community to community. So now I'm going to kind of dig into the ones that have been most impactful and relevant to power outages. Next slide, please. So first of all, I wanted to talk about extreme heat, which of course Illinois is very familiar with. As the power goes out during an extreme heat event, it can be dangerous and even deadly, with people unable to seek shelter in a cool location. And as a result of human-caused climate change, extreme heat is projected to increase across the entire country as the century progresses. So what I'm showing you here is a figure from a report that we did at UCS called Killer Heat in the United States. What you can see here is how days with a heat index above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, that's the feels like temperature, is likely to change as the century progresses. So you can see this for the national story, along with 3 states from the MISO region that Sam and James talked about, and Illinois is kind of in the left center. What you can see is that historically in Illinois, there have been 7 days with a feels like temperature above 100 degrees Fahrenheit in an average year. But as the century progresses, that number is expected to grow to, in orange, I believe it's 43. And if we don't abate greenhouse gas emissions, that number would grow to 69. But if we did meet the Paris Agreement target of limiting greenhouse gases in our atmosphere and limiting global warming, we could cap that number by the end of the century at 33. Next slide, please. Another really consequential extreme weather event are wildfires. Even in a place like Illinois, we're likely to see more of them in a warmer world. This is a result of hotter and drier conditions that are basically the recipe for more wildfires. And obviously, of course, this is the biggest story for the Western United States. I'm sorry, there's an ambulance going by. It's going to be loud for a second. Next slide, please. Now, another event type of event that's really consequential, of course, for Illinois is severe winter weather. Across much of the northern part of the United States, winters have been warming faster than summers, of course, but counterintuitively, we are also seeing more severe winter weather. Since the mid-20th century, most of the country east of the Rocky Mountains, particularly in that part of the region's northern part, so including places like Illinois, there has been an increase in severe winter weather events. And interestingly, this area has been a bit uncertain for a long time in climate science research, but there has been new research that's really revealed a pretty interesting and unfortunate connection between that severe winter weather activity in that part of the United States and Arctic warming. Sometimes we hear about the polar vortex and how, these kinds of storms bring more of that kind of Arctic air into parts of the country like Illinois, and that has a climate connection and implications for power outages. Next slide, please. And quickly to say, obviously, this isn't really an issue for Illinois, but it's very consequential for power outages. Hurricane activity is also tied to global warming and has major consequences for power outages. For example, the back-to-back hurricanes in Florida, Helene and Milton, left 1.3 and 3.4 Floridians without power. And over the last 4 decades, the hurricane intensification rate has increased. And in the future, there's been work that's showed that as global warming emissions increase, more hurricanes and hurricane-induced outages are projected along the eastern seaboard. Next slide, please. So extreme weather events affect energy production in many different ways. I don't have, unfortunately, enough time to get into that specifically in each case, but just to say broadly, for example, during heat waves, nearly all types of power plants struggle. So just to give you some illustrative examples, this can lead to less output, even though there are more customers needing power for air conditioning units, for example, to stay safe. And this can in turn cause power prices to rise steeply and can lead to targeted power outages called load shed as operators are trying to avoid a wholesale widespread collapse of the system. In addition, transmission systems during extreme heat events are affected as power lines can't carry electricity as efficiently and can sag, which also can cause dangerous circumstances with respect to wildfire outbreaks. And this kind of relationship between power production and transmission and extreme weather events is true for all of the other types of events that I talked about today. For example, severe winter storms, which can strain power systems to the point of collapse. Wildfires and hurricanes can also obviously damage transmission infrastructure exactly when communities are needing it most to be able to shelter safely in place. And so please, of course, know that we go into more details about the effects of extreme weather events on the power system in our report, Keeping Everyone's Lights On, that came out earlier this year. But now I wanted to shift in just a little bit for a moment to touch upon some of the resources that you can find to be able to find this information for your own communities. Next slide, please. Just to say, there are a variety of resources available to assess local climate impacts. I would normally point you to climate.gov, but very sadly, that is no longer a resource that's available from the federal government. But I did want to flag an independent initiative called climate.us, which is currently in development. This is a screenshot of that site, and it involves many of the same people and where you can access many of the same resources that were previously available, including, for example, local projections and assessment of how climate change is likely to affect regions, in addition to information through the 5th National Climate Assessment. So again, climate.us. Next slide, please. In addition, as an example of types of resources available with really localized information, this is a snapshot of UCS's extreme heat projections, which are available at the county level for the lower 48 states. With this, you can get information on the kinds of extreme heat information I talked about previously, such as what historical extreme heat conditions have been like and how they're expected to change under different global warming scenarios. Next slide, please. I also wanted to note that the Electric Power Research Institute, EPRI, has a great guide on using climate projections, as well as a great roundup of different data sources. There's a link at the bottom of this slide. These data sources largely, I will say, require more technical and scientific expertise to use than the ones that are available through example, climate.us and UCS. But I did want to mention this because it is a really nice roundup. And next slide, please. Finally, I did want to just also note, as I'm sure is not news to many of you with the University of Illinois connection, you don't have to be alone with these kinds of data. States such as Illinois typically have very helpful state climatologists to help with this kind of information. This is the example of a snapshot from the Illinois State Climatologist website, where there is a wealth of information available about how climate change is likely to affect the state, as well as the contact information for the state climatologist office. And of course, we're here as well, so please feel free to reach out. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, States, who's going to talk about the implications for communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. As we just heard, climate change is intensifying extreme weather events, and our grid wasn't built for this new reality. What that means on the ground is what you see here. These headlines aren't anomalies, they are patterns. And in just the first half of 2025, communities across the country faced power outages from snowstorms, wildfires, and severe thunderstorms. But what these headlines don't tell you is how differently those outages are experienced. There's now a growing body of peer-reviewed research showing that outages consistently hit some communities harder. These studies use detailed census tract level data to show that the most prolonged and frequent outages often occur in places with higher social vulnerability, places where people are already more likely to experience poverty, live in mobile homes and have limited English proficiency, or rely on powered medical devices or live in rural areas. And it means that addressing outages isn't just a question of keeping the lights on, it's a question of equity, health, and who gets prioritized in crisis and recovery. Here's a striking example from New York City, retrieved from POLS Climate, where data from 2017 to 2020 shows how social vulnerability and power outages collide. On the left, you'll see social vulnerability index scores. This includes things like income, housing conditions, health status, and English proficiency. The darker the purple, the more vulnerable the area. On the right, you'll see heat-driven outages occurred from 2017 to 2020. Again, the darker the map, the more outages. What's striking is the overlap. The most vulnerable areas are also the ones hit hardest by outages. And it isn't just about geography, it's about which communities are systematically left out of resilience planning, grid upgrades, and restoration prioritization. So when we talk about resilience, we have to start by understanding it's not just about technology or weather, it's about people, systems, and justice. But let's talk about why duration matters. It's not just whether you lose power, but how long you're without it. For the first few hours, people might lose lights or cooling, but if the power stays out, the consequences can compound quickly. By 12 to 24 hours, you're missing work or school, the food can go bad, but at 2 to 3 days, indoor temps can become unsafe. Medications spoil, communications break down. After a week, you're talking about housing displacement, financial instability, and even trauma, especially for medically vulnerable people, elders, and those without backup options. This is still just for one outage. It doesn't account for what happens when storms repeat, when communities are hit again before they've recovered, when disasters compound physically, emotionally, and financially. And that's why equity has to be the foundation of resilience, because not everyone has the same buffer, the same backup, or the same time to wait. But now that we've seen who is most affected by outages, let's talk about why these patterns persist. Because they're not just random or coincidental. They're rooted in the systems and histories that continue to shape our infrastructure today. Decades of redlining and discriminatory housing policies push Black and Brown communities into areas with fewer resources, places that were later neglected in public infrastructure investment. That disinvestment didn't stop with housing. It also meant fewer upgrades to electrical systems, less tree cover, more exposure to heat, and weaker resilience when disaster strikes. When outages happen, restoration protocols tend to prioritize infrastructure like hospitals and emergency response centers, which is important, of course. But that doesn't always translate to protecting the people who are most vulnerable. Because families here are less likely to own generators, solar systems, backup batteries, or second homes to escape to, the outage can become not just an inconvenience, but a crisis that compounds over time, impacting health, income, and long-term stability. The point here is that these are structural causes and they require structural solutions. We can't just build resilience into the grid. We have to build it into the policies and planning processes that determine who gets protected first. To work towards equity in grid resilience planning, we have to start by shifting our assumptions. Equity means recognizing that not everyone has the same resources, support, or infrastructure to weather outages. And resilience planning should be grounded in energy equity, the fair distribution of risks and benefits, while addressing the historic harms baked into our energy systems. That means redefining the metrics. Instead of looking at load served or speed of restoration, we need to consider things like household income, housing quality, health vulnerabilities, and access to essential services. For planners, that looks like layering in tools like the Social Vulnerability Index or things alongside outage data. So we're prioritizing investments where the need is highest. It also means changing how we engage. Communities need to be involved from the start, not brought in after decisions are made. That means real shared governance, funding for local capacity, translated materials, and paying people for their expertise. These recommendations are grounded in peer-reviewed research, federal data, community experience, including interviews, listening sessions with local advocates, energy justice leaders, and resilience planners nationwide. Because ultimately, resilience isn't just about wires and substations. It's about dignity and safety and self-determination. And some of the most powerful solutions, like resilience hubs, community microgrids, mutual aid networks, are already being built by communities. Our job is to support them and not override them. And with that, I will pass it over to Sam.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Seach, and thank you, Rachel. Yeah, thank you. So sort of taking us back out to a little bit of a high level, our Keeping Everyone's Lights On report includes obviously more details on all of this, but also a really broad range of recommendations that are applicable certainly at the sort of transmission system decision-making level, but are also relevant all the way down to the local level and all the way up to the national level. Because I think what we're seeing more broadly, but from my perspective, really within the transmission space, but more broadly, is that there isn't enough attention being placed on the looming risks of climate change and the impacts of power outages on communities, and how to navigate both of those issues and come up with real solutions that are also complementary to not just what's going on in the community level, but also complementary to the other goals that we need out of our grid, right? Reliability, affordability, and clean, right? And if we're going to do all of that cost effectively, then I think it's very critical that we think about these equity dimensions and we think about the risks posed by climate change when we're thinking about how to invest in the system of the future. So broadly, while we have a lot of recommendations in our report that will be sent around, they broadly fall under 4 categories. First and foremost, we need to be taking advantage of the best available science and analytic tools so that we can understand this risk and we can elevate it in our decision-making process so that we are making decisions that help mitigate this risk of climate change and extreme weather to the power systems. And Rachel's slides shared several of places where you can go to find more information on these various resources. But we do now have the tools to get a much better understanding of what risks does this particular geographic area face when it comes to climate change over the next several decades, and how do we incorporate that into sort of our decision-making process. Second, we need to do more work to really understand the different vulnerabilities of the communities served and identify those that are most vulnerable. Ultimately, when it comes down to it, we need to protect those communities that are most vulnerable. And we need solutions that are specific to the community needs, right? And a lot of times, particularly at the transmission level, you have solutions that are generic across the entire MISO service territory, let's say, right? And understanding these disparities and the differences in how communities experience outages is really needs to inform the solutions that we're coming up with. This all feeds into another bucket of our recommendations, which is improving the planning processes and the cost benefit decision making, right? Ultimately, if we're trying to figure out how to invest in the system, there needs to be a cost benefit element to that decision making, right? We need to feel confident that the benefits provided to society and to the communities are going to outweigh the cost of transmission, which, as we know, can be pretty expensive, right? But there needs to be other things layered on top of that, right? People are not just a cost or a benefit, right? And so we need planning processes that have that element, but also have other elements layered on that take account of some of these other things that we've been talking about today, right? So we need to, I wouldn't say rebuild, but we need to build out how we plan our investment infrastructure investments and how we go about making those decisions. And that gets to our last bucket of recommendations, is really engaging the communities you serve. You know, a lot of folks serve that really rely on entities like MISO to keep the lights on, don't have any idea who or what MISO is. I think that's a real shortcoming in how we go about making these decisions about the transmission system. There are RTO, you know, there are leaders at MISO and other grid operators who have this sort of strong belief that if nobody knows who we are, that's a good thing, because it means we haven't screwed up. And I don't think UCS really buys into that mindset, right? And we really think that the people who are, you know, have this really critical role in terms of maintaining the electric system and building a modern grid based on the criteria we've discussed need to be out there and come out of the shadows and be engaging with communities, so that what decisions they're making are responsive to community needs, and that what they're doing is complementary, like Seat said, complementary to what communities are doing on the ground in terms of resilience. So those are our sort of 4 buckets of recommendations. I think the full list is included in some appendix slides to this presentation that will also be shared, but they're also in the Keeping Everyone's Lights Out on report. And thank you so much for sticking with us through this. I think we have another Menti poll that we'd love to get folks' response to. And after this, we'll move to some Q&A. And I'll just thank everyone again for attending today and giving us this space. We really appreciate it. And I'll just reiterate what I said at the beginning, which is, you know, UCS would love to serve as a resource for anyone looking to sort of understand these dynamics more or get engaged. We see that as very much within our strategic mission. So please don't hesitate to reach out if we can be helpful. And do we want to move to Q&A? I wasn't looking at the chat, so I don't know.
Yes, we do have some time for Q&A. I wasn't sure if you wanted to say, you know, a couple words about the poll results, but also everyone feel free to put questions in the chat as well.
concern and cohesion. That I do like. Yes. Community empowerment, I think, is a big piece here and something we're trying to do. So anyway, thank you for the responses. This is just a few, but anyone should feel free to jump in here.
Thank you so much to all of you for your amazing presentation and for providing these holistic perspectives and making a topic that can be very intimidating, very accessible for folks. And it looks like we do have a question here from Justin at Boone County. It looks like while I'm not in the energy grid industry from my perspective, it appears that data centers are and will be putting more pressure on the grid than many of the environmental/weather conditions. Is data center demand and growth a larger grid resiliency issue than the environment?
I could take a shot at that one unless you're ready, Sam.
No, go for it, James.
Well, I love this question. And actually, right now at UCS, we are working on another analysis looking at meeting data center load growth, primarily with clean energy resources. So we're working on that now, hope to have it out by the end of the year. And I think that it is, along with climate change, I think load growth from data centers are, 1 and 2, 1A and 1B in terms of things that we need to focus on when it comes to moving forward on our electricity grid. And I think one benefit of data centers is that we have the opportunity to control, who's paying for the resources that are needed. We can kind of shape how we incorporate that new technology with climate change and the extreme weather that Rachel went over. There's more things out of our control, and that's why preparing, making sure we're protecting communities for a range of outcomes is part of our resilience approach. I don't know, what do other UCSers have to say about this question?
I think that's a great answer, James. I mean, certainly, yeah, data centers are analogous to an extreme event, right? So and I'll just tee up another analysis we also have coming out of UCS, hopefully by the end of the month, that is going to look at, when a data center connects to the grid, there are upgrades that need to happen to the system, to the transmission system, to accommodate that large load. These loads can be, they're small cities. Down in New Orleans, they just call them another Baton Rouge. Yeah, how many Baton Rouges are we going to add? So the upgrades to the system, especially at the transmission level, often get socialized to all ratepayers. And obviously that's a problem, right? We're talking about billions and billions of dollars to pay to connect these data centers. So there's certainly a cost element to it. Meeting that enormous demand with clean energy resources certainly adds to the challenge. And maintaining reliability when you have this huge load that can fluctuate pretty dramatically, even under normal operating conditions, is going to be a challenge. So certainly if you think about extreme conditions, extreme weather conditions, extreme heat, and they're trying to cool a data center, or an extreme condition that may take a data center offline very quickly, losing that much power very quickly on the system is another sort of critical, urgent issue for a grid operator, right? So the data center piece is another piece of the puzzle that we can't lose sight of when we're thinking about maintaining reliability, thinking about all the metrics that I put in that previous slide about reliability, affordability, climate resilience, equity. It really touches on all of those. And it's moving extremely quickly. And so we have a lot of concerns about how this is going to roll out, because I don't know if the regulatory and sort of social constructs are capable of keeping up with the demand to build these things.
Thank you so much for your answers to that question. It's great to hear that you all are working on that topic because I know we've been getting a lot of questions about data centers as well. It looks like we do have a question here about battery storage, but I know that's something that we will be going on the second webinar about. So do you want to give kind of a brief teaser trailer for that
Yeah.
now?
Sure. So BESS stands for battery energy storage systems, and these are batteries that we can put on the power grid or people can have in their homes, and they basically store electricity to be used when we need it, and can be deployed onto the grid. And Illinois right now is considering some important policies around increasing battery storage deployment. So we will definitely talk more about that in part 2.
Excellent. And it looks like we've got a couple other questions trickling in. Would you all have anything to say about balcony solar by chance? It looks like someone's asking about how that is something that is coming up and wondering how that might impact the grid, especially as renters and homeowners would be able to generate 1.5 kilowatts to cover a portion of their energy needs.
I actually just heard some colleagues from an organization called Vote Solar talking about this today. And so what I can do is see if I can get a little more info and bring that into part 2 of our webinar, maybe how Illinois policy could help accommodate that type of technology.
Right.
Yeah, and I would just add, from a bit of a high system level, my understanding is that you can plug the solar, right? You can plug the system sort of right into your wall, and it's putting power back into your home. And so I suspect there will need to be policies in place that sort of force or incentivize or cajole the utilities into designing systems that can accommodate that. So whenever you're putting power back on the system, it makes the utility very, very nervous. Part of that is fake because they want to be the ones generating the power, because that's their business model. And part of that is real because when they're trying to fix things, when you're trying to service things, you need to know where the power is coming from so that you can make sure whoever's working on that system is not exposed to dangers of electricity, right? And so they will have some probably justified heartburn over the idea of a lot of people plugging power, these solar systems back into their wall. It's all, from a technical standpoint, completely manageable. It all, from a utility standpoint, it's probably going to save them a lot of headache down the road to figure out how to accommodate these because it's a local solution. But you'll probably need some sort of state involvement just to get the utilities to move quickly enough to do whatever it takes in terms of their protocols that allow these systems to be plugged back in safely. So.
Really appreciate that answer. It looks like we have time for one more question. There's a question about underground delivery of transmission and, could that increase resilience of the grid?
Absolutely. Almost across the board, except in cases of flooding, undergrounding is a more resilient option. It tends to be, I think they will generally say it's like 10 times more expensive. I don't think that's the case quite anymore, but it is significantly more expensive than overhead wires, and does come with some of its own risks, although the risk profile of undergrounding tends to be quite a bit more narrow than overhead. It tends to be, like I said, more resilient, not just in day-to-day operations, but to extreme conditions. So it really sort of gets to this cost-benefit analysis and thinking about the additional cost of undergrounding that particular project and what kind of benefits are you going to get from it. And if the benefits are helping a community, survive an extreme event that may occur, that is likely to occur no matter, even if it's not super frequent, then certainly that should be an option that's on the table. We really need to start thinking about, like I said, getting better metrics to be like, well, what are we getting out of this increased investment? And there are certainly situations, and we're seeing a lot of this in California and the West Coast now with the wildfires, where the prevalence of wildfires is just so significant that spending the extra money on undergrounding these lines to protect them during wildfires, to protect them from causing other wildfires, is sort of a no-brainer now. And so we need that type of thinking sort of across the board over a much broader range of risks.
Thank you so much. Well, I know that we are at time here, but it is so great to see all of the questions coming in on this topic. And we will be doing a part 2 next week. So especially if you're curious about solutions, what can we do, how to get involved, that is exactly what we will be covering. So thank you again to our presenters. This was fantastic. And for Prairie Rivers Network recording this, and we look forward to seeing all of you next week at noon to talk about solutions for the grid in Illinois. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.
Take care.